Thank you for listening to the Big Ideas for Better Places podcast from CityWorks Expo. Before we get to today's episode, we want to take a quick moment and let you know that CityWorks Expo 8, Anticipating 2050, Acting Today, will be occurring October 4th through 6th in Roanoke, Virginia. We've got some really exciting speakers and some other activities lined up that we're excited about. If you all are interested, please check us out at cityworksexpo.com. That's cityworksexpo.com. And real quick, before we get to today's episode, just want to let you all know that we'd really appreciate if you could give us a rating or review on whatever platform you're listening to this, whether that be Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, or wherever else you might be finding it. This rating and review really help other people find out about the podcast and the incredible guests that we have. But now, without further ado, let's get on to today's episode.
Please listen carefully.
Welcome to the Big Ideas for Better Places podcast from CityWorks Expo. My name is Brad Stevens, and I'll be your host today. It's my absolute pleasure to introduce you to our guest, Ms. Veronica Davis, co-founder of both Nspiregreen and Black Women Bike. How are you doing today, Veronica?
I'm doing wonderful. Thank you for having me.
Of course, it's absolutely our pleasure. I love the work that you guys do. I think it's you're an inspiration to so many people, and I'm looking forward to digging into some of your stuff today.
I'm looking forward to talking about it. I can talk transportation and places all day, every day.
Well, very good. Well, I wonder if we could kind of start with how you kind of define the work that you do and what your place is in this conversation.
Well, in my, work hat, I am the co-owner of Nspiregreen, and we're a planning and design studio located in the District of Columbia. We do multimodal planning, community planning, and climate and resiliency planning. And all of those things really go together. At the end of the day, it's about how do you really create a sustainable community and a sustainable city. We have had the pleasure of working on several livability studies, which is what we call them here in the District of Columbia, where we look at mobility, safety, and green infrastructure all at one time. And with that, we've created some really great conceptual designs to improve safety for people walking, for people biking, and just moving throughout the district.
I'm intrigued because this term livability has come up in a number of places now. And when you hear that term, what comes to mind for you?
When I think of livability, I think about my childhood. I think sometimes we forget that as children, we played in the street. I remember in high school, we would play football or soccer in the middle of the street. And to me, that's indication of livability because it was very low volume roads, but also people were very aware that kids were in the street and they would slow down. You would yell car, everyone would scatter to the side. The car would slowly creep through. But to me, that was community, and that is livability. It's where you're able, particularly children are able to play with their neighbors and play with their friends without a fear of, being struck by a car, where older residents can walk outside and still be a part of the community. And there's a lot of research that shows that it helps with longevity of life. But it really is just about being a part of a community. And that's what livability is for me. And part of that really comes to having safer streets that feel comfortable, that have, shade trees, that have grass and green infrastructure, that have safe sidewalks, that have places where cars aren't driving fast. That to me is livability.
That's so interesting. One of the themes that has come out a couple of times in this podcast is that when we look at communities, if the children and the elderly are doing well, that's usually an indication that the rest of things are going well.
Absolutely. I think that, when children can play outside, when older people feel comfortable sitting outside, it really is an indication. All the rest of us kind of work our way, in the middle. But I think that is a true indication of the health and the spontaneity of the community. I just moved to an area in D.C. called Manor Park, and I absolutely love my block. When it's warm outside, the kids are playing in the street, they're running all around, the older people are sitting on the porch, and it creates a level of vibrancy. When I get home from work and there's, people having a Michael Jackson dance party on their porch, And it's a great thing to come home to of, wow, there's this place, there's this life that's happening, there's this vibrancy that's happening. And it's great to be a part of this neighborhood.
Well, I know that your particular role is often looking at the transportation side of things. Where does that kind of fit in your mind in this broader conversation about places and livability?
I think transportation is that glue. It's that holds everything together. It's almost kind of like the veins in your body that moves the blood to all the other organs and other parts of the body. I mean, to me, that is what transportation is that you really have these great places, and it's really about having neighborhoods where even if I can't walk to the grocery store, I should be able to walk easily to a bus that will get me to a grocery store, and that bus should be on time and it should be reliable. So to me, transportation is it's the thing that holds the community together. It's the opportunity and access. It's the access to opportunity, whether it's to jobs, to healthy foods, to education. So I think it's an absolutely important part of the city.
Well, and it's, I think I was intrigued reading some of your bio and stuff that you've been interested in this stuff way back into your childhood, weren't you?
Well, I think that's what happens when you grow up with parents who are both in the transportation industry. My sister, she ended up a doctor, but I think at that time my mom was working in a different field, so that's probably how she skated by into this another field. But my dad's a civil engineer, and my mom was in human resources, but for New York City Transit Authority. My dad worked for the Port of Elizabeth. Worked at the Port of Elizabeth with shipping and freight and all of that at the time that I was, younger. And so when I was off of school, I was at either New York City Transit Authority or I was at the Port of Elizabeth. So that was my, childhood free time. And then I think also my parents really cultivated an interest in more so the sciences, but transportation. My dad bought me a Lionel train set when I was little, and I still have it. And I would set that up downstairs in the circle, but then I would also create my town. So I had My Little Ponies too. So I had my My Little Pony area. I had the little people, which were little wooden people, and I created these towns with my little people. And then I had G.I. Joes, and so that was my army to protect everyone. And so I would play downstairs in my own created world, and then my Lionel train was what got goods and people to where they needed to go. So I think that my parents did a really great job of cultivating that interest when I was younger.
Well, as I'm hearing that, the thing that jumped out in my mind is this idea that you were given a train set, and with that train set, you built communities around that train set, which I think we often don't think about in this transportation sense, that almost all of our communities are built around transportation hubs in some ways. And so it's the core of communities in some ways.
Absolutely. And, when you're traveling, it's really interesting sometimes when you're in random places and then you're like, well, how did this town get here? How did these people get here? And when you look at historical maps and you say, particularly for the older rail systems, largely many of them are gone, but you say, oh, okay, this was a rail hub. That makes sense.
Well, I'm interested now as that looks back at, the obviously trains and still play a huge role, but they were even bigger back in the day. And now we're looking at automobiles and multimodal stuff. And I wonder kind of when you look at the future of transportation, what do you kind of see defining that future?
I think the future, we're going to be at a point where we're going to have to make some tough decisions. Right now, all the buzz, I went to Transportation Research Board's annual meeting, and I felt like every session they were talking about TNCs, the networking companies like the Ubers and the Lyfts. They were talking about autonomous vehicles. Every session was talking about that. And we can't get so focused on technology that we also forget that there are overarching goals. We don't want to use technology to answer wrong questions. And right now we're looking at technology to answer, well, how do we move people that aren't able to move? And autonomous vehicles are going to be great because it'll allow people who are elderly to be in a car if they can't see or they don't have mobility. And the real question is still, how do we move more people? If our population is going to continue to increase and we're not focused on the idea of moving more people, we're not really going to solve anything with autonomous vehicles. And I think at the end of the day, even when you look at the evolution of transportation, the bicycle has stayed pretty consistent. You know, our motor vehicles have changed over time. They're getting smarter. You know, they're adding cameras, they're adding safety features. But the bicycle is a bicycle. And I think it's always going to be part of our repertoire, even into the future. And I think it's also an important part of our health as we move to the future, that people can walk and people can bike. And so as the transportation system evolves, we have to remember people still need to be able to walk and people still need to be able to bike. And, you know, we just have there's so many unknowns that it's hard to make decisions, but then we're still having to plan our 30-year future when we don't really know what the next 5 years are going to look like. And so it's an interesting time to be in as a professional. I think there's just so many ways that we can go, and I think they're going to be our key decisions that are going to set up what the future looks like.
Do you think when you look at that future, do you look at it with hope, or is there some apprehension there?
I think both. There's part of me that's apprehensive in that we're the way the conversation's being held now, it's in a place where you have a lot of private companies talking about it, like Elon Musk and his Mag Lab, Hyperloop, whatever he's trying to do. But there's also a sense, and I don't know if you've seen some of the things that he said about that, but there's also a sense of classism that comes with that. So yes, it's about speed of moving between cities, but then there's also this, we're moving faster so you don't have to use these other modes. And I think we don't know how the private sector is going to begin to price these private technologies and private systems. And so there's a real equity concern when that's not at the design phase of how do we make sure that we can still, people who may not have the means can still move. I also look at it with a sense of hope. We are creating mega regions. When you look at the DC region as an example, you have people commuting from West Virginia, from Pennsylvania every day to come to work in the district. You have people that are commuting from DC to Baltimore. We have several projects in Philadelphia, so we make these day trips from DC to Philly, and it can be done. And so I think that I think we have to start thinking mega regionally of how are people really moving through, particularly like the Northeast corridor. And I think there is a lot of hope. I think that there are a lot of young people who are very smart, who are very enthused about tackling some of these challenges. We've hired a lot of these very young, very smart people who want to do really great work, who want to bring technology and new ideas, but then there's a sense of compassion and a sense of focus on equity and making sure that we're serving all members of the community.
I love that sense of compassion. That I kind of feel like if we could have all of these conversations and imbue everything we do with a sense of compassion, we'd probably be better off for all of our works through that.
This past summer, I'm the Cornell alum, and I spoke at a Cornell summer program, this Catalyst program, where they bring young people, mostly, people of Latinos and African American descent, but they bring these young people to Cornell, and so I spoke to them about the future of transportation, and I talked about what our industry has really been doing, and we haven't really evolved our transportation modeling in the last 40 years, but looking forward, there's really a lot of opportunity. And I think the generation even coming up behind me that are in high school now, they are really I'm excited for them. This to me is what gets me excited about the future. I'm really excited for them to go to college and to get into the workforce because I gave them a challenge to create a system of the future. And I gave them equity things to think about. But they went beyond what I even asked them to think about. I said, well, think about, persons with disabilities or seniors and how they move. And they took it 4 steps further of how to revitalize communities that they live in, how to prevent or at least reduce the impact of gentrification on lower income households. So they're very compassionate. They read, they understand what's happening in the world. And I'm just really excited about the future workforce. I can't wait for them. I can't wait to hire them as interns. I can't wait to hire them as young planners. I think that they're beaming with ideas, they're beaming with excitement, and they have that compassion for the world.
That's a very compelling and very hope-filled vision. I do wonder, when you think about, like, when you guys are doing a plan for a place and you're thinking about those equity issues, and when you're thinking about how do we build a compassionate plan for this area, what are those places? What does that mean in a logistical way? What questions does that force you to ask? What issues does that bring onto the table that you wouldn't necessarily be thinking about otherwise?
The biggest thing it forced us to ask is who is a part of the planning process. In any city, USA, if you have a public meeting, I'm willing to bet any city planner will tell you who is going to show up. I can name, my staff go to public meetings sometimes that I'm not at, and they'll say, oh, this woman, and I'm like, let me guess, she looked like this, she looked like that. Yes, okay, that was so-and-so. You know who the regular meeting attendees are. And so with that, you've already limited the voices just by the fact that you're having a traditional public meeting. And no matter how much outreach you do, no matter how much engagement you do, somehow you still end up with the same voices. One of the biggest things that we do is we go to communities. We go to where people already are. Our biggest success we've had is with what we call pop-up meetings. And it literally is what it sounds like. We pop up in an area where there's foot traffic in a neighborhood, which means that we sometimes announce our visit, sometimes we don't. But it's a way to just get people. People are walking down the street. People are taking the bus. They get off the bus. They walk right into our meeting. People get off the metro. They walk right into our meeting. And with that, we found that we tend to reach a more diverse group of stakeholders, so much so that it better reflects the ethnicity, age, and income of the community that we're trying to do a plan for.
That is the magic question in some ways, in so many fields, is how do we get people's voices out here? But I do think that there's a secondary question in some ways in terms of how do we make sure that once people's voices are heard, that is integrated into the plan that comes out of that. And I wonder kind of how you guys make sure that when you've collected these voices and collected this input, that is then represented in the plan that comes out.
What we do, we transcribe every single comment that we get, and we read them. And from that, what we do is we call, what are the big takeaways? We try to tease out, what are the big ideas? What are the big concerns? And then what we always do at our public meeting is we always have a what we heard board to say, this is what we heard from you, and this is how we address that concern, or how maybe this concern isn't relevant to this project, but we sent it to the team, to the team that it is relevant to, or we're not able to do that with this project because it's a little bit outside of the scope. So it's about giving that feedback to the community of, I heard you say you were concerned about this. This is how we were able to address that concern, or here's some ideas to address that concern. And that's also important, because otherwise people are going to stop giving their opinion. And that's how, part of the reason why when we started the company, we came up with that type of a feedback loop, because I was getting frustrated being in my neighborhood, and I would give feedback on a plan, and it felt like it just went into this vortex. And my concern or my feedback was never addressed. I couldn't see how my feedback shaped the outcomes. And I think that's important if you want to continue and have enduring relationships with the community.
That makes so much sense in terms of you're going to be an active listener in this community. You're going to go in and listen to them. But if you're listening to them and you're not talking with them, then it's really not a conversation then at that point, is it?
Not at all. Not at all. And people want to be involved, and people really have good ideas. I think, one of the things that we do, particularly when we're leading a planning effort, is it really is about listening to the community. I can pull data. I can tell you how many people drove down your street. I can tell you how many car crashes there were. But you live on your street every single day. So you know all the little nuances, and you all know all the things that are going to work. And you know where there might be people that have a different set of needs that need to be accommodated. So it really is about planning with the community and not doing it for the community. Because at the end of the day, when the plan is done, I'm going back to my neighborhood. And it really is about creating plans that you would even want to live in, and then that making sure you're creating a plan that the community champions and they're proud of. Because that's really what's going to help on the implementation side, is people who feel like they were part of the process and they champion the implementation to make sure it gets done.
Well, I'm also intrigued by this kind of idea that on the flip side, I'm sure that you hear stuff that is not necessarily a productive part of the conversation, or there are concerns that you perhaps don't want to worry about. So I'm thinking here particularly in Roanoke and the community that I'm most familiar with, people complain about parking all the time, and I want to hit them over the head because, like, if you never tried to find a parking spot around DuPont Circle, this is a ridiculous conversation for us to have in Roanoke. But people still complain about it all the time.
Oh, parking is like the third rail of politics. There's never enough. People have an expectation that I will park right in front of my house. We had one project where it was a parking came up, and I think it was just a frank. I think part of it is people don't understand the trade-off. And was one particular, she was an older woman, and she was complaining of taking away, it was like literally probably about 3 feet of parking in order to do a curb bump out, such that the pedestrian could be further in the street, but on the sidewalk where they could be seen by a car coming up the street. And I said point blank, I said, well, look, this is what you said. So what you all said, what your community members have said, is that they are concerned about their ability to cross the street. So one way to make it safer is that we do these curb bump outs. We have to take 3 feet of parking. So your options are you either have parking or you get hit. I mean, that's really what it comes down to. We can't make it, you either make it safer or we don't. And when you present it as that of it's an either or, you either have parking or you have these other things, people are, okay, I understand what you're saying. Okay, let's do the curb bump out. And I think people are generally reasonable, but when they don't know what their options are, I think we forget that the general public doesn't live in the world that we live in. They're not thinking about transportation. People don't think about transportation. What people do is they get in their car, they drive to work, or they get on their bus and they go to work. And unless everything fails, no one thinks about transportation. And so it's about helping to present those options. At that same public meeting, and this is actually a nice segue into Black Women Bike, these women came up to me and they were upset. Oh my God, you can't put a bike lane. You're upset with me. And I didn't fight back. So I asked questions. I said, so why can't we, so what's your concern about the bike lane? Well, I don't bike. Oh, well, why don't you bike? Well, I'm old. You're not that old. I'm retiree. I'm old. I can't bike. And I said, well, we have women in Black Women Bike that are probably your contemporaries or older, and they bike. Oh, well, I'm big. I'm too heavy to bike. We have women that are bigger than you that bike all the time. And then once you do that and you realize that what people are sometimes angry about is you're creating something that they can't use. And in their mind that they think that they can't use it. And it's about presenting the only limitation to you using it is you. You can bike and you can get on a bike. And what we found with Black Women Bike is that our growing membership is young retirees because of the federal government and the older system of the federal government and the pension system and everything. And with DC government, we're finding that there's a lot of people who are retiring at late 50s, early 60s. And they're still young, they're vibrant, and they want to be active. And we're getting them on bicycles. And, to me, it's about helping people see, with the communities, when they look at me, they're going to say, okay, well, you're young and you're fit. Of course you could bike. But being able to present this other option of, no, I have women that are your age and your size, and they're biking. And as a matter of fact, I will facilitate an introduction, and you guys can bike together. And then it helps the conversation, and then people feel like, oh, well, so maybe this thing isn't so hard to do.
We'd like to take a moment now to say thank you to our sponsors today. The Urban Affairs and Planning program at Virginia Tech's School of Public and International Affairs offers an interdisciplinary approach to understanding planning and policy for megaregions, cities, suburbs, and rural regions in the U.S. and abroad. UAP faculty have expertise in urban planning, architecture, urban design, economics, geography, political science, law, technology, and engineering, and provide students with a multifaceted understanding of how communities grow and change. Students apply their knowledge and professional skills by participating in real-world problem solving with community clients through project-based studios and applied research. UAP emphasizes technical analysis and policy evaluation in approaching the complexities of modern communities. So a big thanks today to the Urban Affairs and Planning program down at Virginia Tech for being our sponsor. If you'd like to hear more, check them out online. But without further ado, we'll get back to today's guests. Thank you. There's just there's so much to unpack there, and I think I want to kind of start with this idea of how do you get people engaged in this what is often a very daunting task. Even myself, who is a fairly adept bike rider, gets a little nervous sometimes riding through cities, and I wonder how you get people comfortable. I don't know if in DC you closed down Rock Creek Parkway, which is amazing on some weekends, and so is that what is your way of kind of getting people introduced to city riding and getting comfortable in that space?
At Black Women Bike, we have two ways to do it. So one, every April we have a seminar that we put together, and it's called How to Ride on the Streets of DC Safely. And just the title alone, people say, okay, yes, I want to go. And with that, it's a 2-hour seminar where we walk people through the different infrastructure. There's a lot of new infrastructure in DC, and there's definitely new infrastructure that didn't exist when I was a kid, let alone in college or in high school or anything. So it's helping to explain to people what's the infrastructure and how do you use it. For example, a bike box. How do you use a bike box? How do you make a left-hand turn? There are different ways to make a left-hand turn. So we go take people through this 2-hour seminar, and then we break into smaller groups and take people out on the street so that they can experience it. And then as they go through different situations, we talk them through it. We talk them through how to navigate around the bus and the best place to be such to avoid any, interactions with the bus. And that is a very popular seminar. One of the, specific outcomes of the seminar is we had a woman who showed up. She had all the attitude. I mean, just didn't want to be there, was adamant that she was not going to bike on the streets of DC. But what we did was give her the confidence to try. Not only now does she bike as her primary form of commuting, but she also works for the Washington Area Bicyclists Association as a bike advocate. So, we are able to get people to be believers that they can do it. The other thing that we do, we have monthly rides where we split the group. We take some people on trails, which I personally don't like trails. And then we take some people on the street, which is my favorite part. And it's the same thing. It's an opportunity to give people, to learn the different infrastructure. And most of the people who want to do the street ride are people who are very confident cyclists. These are women that have done centuries, but, they haven't biked on the street with cars and buses and other bicycles and different, infrastructure. And so we get them on the street and help them to develop that confidence to think that, you don't just have to bike when there's, a race or a century or touring or whatever, but you can actually just bike to the grocery store. It is possible.
I'm intrigued. You've got this organization, Black Women Bike, and I think part of what interests me about that is when I look at my own community and when I think about who is biking in this community, there's kind of two different groups there. There's the group that bikes from necessity because they don't have any other forms of transportation, and then there's the group that is kind of the elite biking community that kind of goes out and does centuries and goes out on the weekends with their very expensive bikes to ride around. And I wonder, it seems like what you're doing in some ways is trying to broaden that scale and say that there's a place for all of us to use transportation options. Is that kind of where you see your goal in some ways?
Absolutely. I don't believe in, I remember there was a paper that came out a couple of years ago that talked about the different types of cyclists, and it was the fast and furious, the interested but concerned, and the no way, no how. I personally, I don't think that I think there's very few no way, no how. And I think, as we think about biking, we do need to think about how do we make it accessible for all people. We have 2 women that are visually impaired that bike with us, and we take them on the streets of DC. Obviously, they're on a tandem with a sighted partner, but it gives them an opportunity to, one, be a part of a group and be a part of a community. And then 2, it, gives them an experience beyond just biking on a trail that doesn't change. It gives them different sounds and different smells and just a different experience. So I'm really not convinced that I'm convinced that anybody can get on a bike. I'm convinced that everybody can get on a bike. And for people with different levels of mobility challenges, I think that it's up to the bike manufacturers to come up with a way to make biking accessible. But I think anybody can do it.
Well, how, in terms of there being stigma around bikes and people that still kind of look down on people riding bikes, and the number of folks that still get angry is kind of mind-boggling when they feel like their way is being impeded in their cars. Kind of how do you have that broader conversation that's not just for the bikers themselves, but also for the broader community that says, hey, we need to embrace bicycle as a good thing for all of us in some ways?
In my advocacy hat as a person who bikes, I don't fight anymore. I've learned fighting doesn't get you anywhere except for an argument, because then when you try to preach the gospel of biking, people are shut off to it because they don't believe it. So what I do now is I just invite them for a ride. I say, you know what? You pick the day and the time, and I will meet you, and we will go on a bike ride. A prime example is Cortland Malloy. He's a reporter here in the D.C. area. He's like that drunk uncle that you really want to love, but they say inappropriate things, and that is Cortland. And he said a lot of inappropriate things about people on bikes. And, the bike community, they protested outside of, Washington Post, which wasn't going to get anywhere. But I reached out to, Cortland. I said, look, Cortland, let's go for a bike ride. And I did take him on a ride around the city. I didn't change his heart completely, but I think it at least opened his eyes to the vulnerability of being a person who bikes. There's actually a funny clip, and it's still in the Washington Post, where he almost gets hit. And I think it's just it was a reminder for him of his vulnerability as a person when being on a bike. So there's that. In my kind of professional world hat, I think the problem is we have to confront people with facts. Some people don't like facts, but for people who like facts, it is about presenting the facts. And the fact of the matter is that our area is congested. We can't fix it. There's no fixing congestion. You can make it less worse, and you can move more people, but we can't fix quote unquote congestion. We can't widen our streets. And that's just a general policy of the city. Plus, there's nowhere to widen the streets to. So we have what we have. And so when this is what we have to use our resources differently. And we have to think about how do we get as many people as we can out of cars, such that if you still need to use your car, that is okay. Mm-hmm. And no one's trying to take away your car, but it's about giving you more options. Every time you walk out of your house, your car shouldn't be your only option. We should be able to say, well, you could do this, you could do this, you could do this, or you could drive. And then, for some people, they may make different decisions by having other options. And we have to move people. And what we do know is that we can change the signal timing on the lights all we want. Those cars aren't going anywhere. We can't move them. And the only way to move more cars is that we need to get people out of cars and move more people. And that's through better public transportation. It's about getting people on bicycles. It's about getting more people walking.
Well, that's so interesting. And I do want to take a little bit of a step back now and go back to that conversation you mentioned where these women were unhappy with you in that in the push for bike lanes. And I wonder kind of from that, there's this really interesting question that runs out in my mind that so much of what we build in cities is only for certain people. There's certain people that probably don't want us to invest in schools because they don't have children. There's people that don't want us to invest in, certain businesses because they don't see those as necessary or things that they're interested in being involved in. And I wonder kind of how you go about creating a shared vision and showing that these things, even if someone doesn't choose to use that particular business or frequent that particular business, that they know that is an important part of the broader whole and that shared vision that we have as a community.
Brad, it's just like one of the simplest solutions, and you're going to probably laugh at is it really that simple? And part of the problem is that when you look at renderings for most bike infrastructure, pick any city, USA, and look at the renderings of what this will look like. I'm willing to bet 9 times out of 10 that majority of the people in the photo are white. Regardless of what community is, the majority of the people in the photo are white. And it's just like an advertisement, right? So ad agencies know that they have a target demographic, and they target that demographic through photos and through pictures and through the models that they select, so that it's a thing that happens. And for people of color, well, there's no black people in the photos, so clearly you're not thinking about me biking. And it's such a fundamental problem, and it's such an easy fix. Even if you look at, for bike share, some of the older bike share advertisements around the country, go actually look at the ads. There's very little diversity. And when there is diversity, it's what I call United Colors of Benetton diversity, where it's like white woman, Asian woman, Indian woman, and they're all happy and they're smiling artificially. But there's a projection of the type of people that they are. There's a perception of the type of job that they work at. So a very kind of like the simplest thing to make people feel included is to put pictures of people that look like them in the renderings, in the advertising, in, if there's a bike, race coming up or just any type of bike event, use people that look like people in the community. And that's both from an age perspective, an ethnicity, a income through what people are wearing. But showing that diversity, because that's just like people's first signal of, I'm included in this. So people want me to be involved. And I can't tell you how many times I've seen renderings. I've worked on teams where we've had to fix renderings to just put people of color in their rendering. And I think, part of the challenge is that there's a lack of diversity in some of the firms that are doing this work. And so that's a fundamental problem. But, it's just such a small thing. And there's also sometimes a lack of diversity in the bike advocacy groups. And so there's just not a consciousness of it. And so I think for people that are doing anything that is print material or any type of digital material with pictures and things like that, you've got to show the diversity of the community that you were working in, because if not, you've lost people before you started.
Well, that's so fascinating. And I think absolutely true. And I think, you mentioned it kind of goes back, I think, a lot of times to the people that are creating these renderings, whether they be local government or whether they be firms. There's not a diversity of people in those places to begin with too often.
Absolutely. And I think that we need to so I'm on the Civil Engineering Advisory Board for Cornell University. And one of the things, and my mission is to increase the number of enrollment of African Americans and Latinos within the program. And my specific concern is, I graduated from my master's in 2003. I was one of two Black people, and most of the other people of color were international in that they were literally going back to their home countries. But I was but domestic side, I was one of two Black people, and that was it for diversity. And in that time, even through 2016, that number hasn't increased. And so when we're not adding people to the profession that look like the communities that we're consulting for on the consultant side, or that we're serving on the public servant side, that's a fundamental problem. And I think there needs to be more of a pipeline for people. And I think part of it is, I think there are a lot of very smart, Black and brown children out there, but they don't know that this is a career option. And quite frankly, the only reason why I knew transportation was a career option is because I lived in a family of people in the industry. But there's so many people that don't know about urban planning. I didn't know about urban planning until, I met a professor in my junior year of college, and I was like, urban planning, you could do that? Like, that's a thing? And so it's even just providing exposure to young people so that they can understand all of their job options.
Well, I think this is absolutely true. And I think it probably goes back to some of your comments earlier about how we do public input, in terms of, I think that if you have this firm that shows up, whether they're a government-based organization or whether they're a private company, and they show up and they've got, 4 really hipster-looking white people there, they're probably not going to hear the same things from that community and that engagement process that you would if you had a more diverse group of people there to have that conversation.
There's that, but I also think there's something to be said about having people on your team that know the community. We do a pretty good job here in D.C. Most of us live in D.C. We're very entrenched and involved in the broader D.C. community. But even when we do work in other cities, we always team with a local firm because I think it is important to have someone that just knows the community.
That's such an interesting fact in terms of I wonder how you guys, when you're going into that, how do you determine who that best partner is and who knows that community the best? Because I don't necessarily think that every community or every firm that's part of a community knows that community particularly well.
Yeah, I mean, part of it is making phone calls. I mean, that's like the simplest thing of trying to make some phone calls to just vet to see who knows the community. The other piece of it is working through existing social infrastructures that exist. And that could be churches, it could be different other places of worship, it could be synagogues, mosques, all of those places, but then community serving organizations. We did that when we did the Move DC plan for the city, and that's our city's long-range transportation plan. We did a lot of outreach to nonprofit groups because they're really working in the community in a very different way, and they're not thinking about transportation. And they don't have a hidden agenda. They're just really trying to do the best that they can for the different constituency groups that they serve. We learned a lot from the homeless service providers about how people with just housing insecurity and, chronic homelessness are moving around the city and how they're making decisions. And that was feedback that was invaluable that we wouldn't have gotten had we not reached out to these nonprofits.
Well,
and I'm sorry to interrupt. And even the work that we're doing in the city of Philadelphia, we did very specific focus groups to make sure that we're getting at, well, how do these groups communicate? What are their tools? Because there's what you think they use and there's what they use. And, one of the things that we learned that there's a large Chinese community in Philadelphia, and they use WeChat, and that is how they communicate with each other. And partly because WeChat it's allowed in China versus some of the other apps and some of the other messaging apps aren't. And you wouldn't know that unless you really ask the question. So that's another tactic, is just even using focus groups to understand the community and understand what are the concerns, and then being very specific about what type of a person you want in that focus group. And usually you focus on the people that aren't going to come to it, the underrepresented groups.
Part of what comes to me from hearing you talk about this, and I think it's something that goes through all of your stuff, is there's a certain, you're approaching all of this with a certain humility, that you have a certain set of knowledge, but when you go into a community, there are all kinds of things that you don't know that you need to find out before you can even begin to do anything. And I think that's an incredibly compelling vision to kind of have and share.
At Nspiregreen, we call it the LEAF model, and it's listen, engage, analyze, feedback. And anytime we do anything, it's you listen first. I had a project in Belize where not only now am I in a different community, I'm in a different culture, completely different culture. So I spent the whole first 2 days that I was there just listening and observing. How do people move? How do people move the street? What are they concerned about? What is their vision for the future? And then taking that and giving them ideas that are culturally relevant. There's no way that I'm going to show Belize pictures of DC. It's not the same context. It's not a relevant context. No one in Belize is going to bike in a bike lane. It's just not it's a culture of this is how we move and we all figure it out. But what I was able to show them was photos of, my travels through Colombia and other Latin American countries to show a very similar context of how, biking and bike infrastructure and pedestrian infrastructure can be better in a context that makes sense to them and that matches the context that they're living in. And so to me, that's also important. I think sometimes, in the U.S., we look so much to Europe of, oh my goodness, Amsterdam, they're doing all these things. It's just a completely different culture. So while we can pull really good ideas, we also have to remember the culture of the U.S. and then how do we adapt that idea to fit our culture, which is it's just different.
Well, I wonder, as you go to these different communities, whether they be in Belize or Philadelphia or DC or even different neighborhoods within these communities, I wonder kind of when you're going into a new place, what are the things that are there universal things that you look for to kind of tip you off to let you know how a community is doing or whether some things are going right or not in that community?
Well, first, it's always observation. I do like to just, drive around, walk around, bike around to get a sense of the community from different perspectives. What is it like to bike here? What do I feel biking here? Do I feel uncomfortable? Do I feel safe? Is this a pleasant place to walk? So that's number one. Two, we try to, as I mentioned, try to do focus groups to get to know the community, but it'll depend on the demographics of the community. That's a very easy demographic analysis to see, okay, what's happening with this community, because sometimes a community can look monolithic, but then when you peel back the onions, it's not. So it could be a majority Black community, but you have people from the African diaspora where they are descendants of Africa, so they're African Americans, but then you have African immigrants, and then you have African immigrants from different homelands, because Africa is a continent and not a country. You have people from different homelands, so those are different cultures and different views of things. Same with, people, from Latin America. Someone from Guatemala is very different, has a different view of the world than someone from Colombia or Panama. So it's about understanding what are the homelands, and then, perhaps doing focus groups or different types of kickoff meetings to get to understand that community and the concerns. The other thing is really simple, is look what the community is already complaining about. And that's usually, most cities have some type of a complaint system or a feedback system. And you can just pull that historical information and see what the concerns are in this neighborhood. Are they constantly complaining about litter? Or are they constantly complaining about cars speeding down the street? It's already been said. So it's trying to understand what the community's already said, because there's nothing more frustrating. Back to that whole feedback loop I said, there's nothing more frustrating to a community where I've complained for 10 years to X government agency about this issue, and now I have this consultant asking me what are my concerns. Mm-hmm. I've told you. Versus if a consultant can say, hey, community, so we went back and looked at some historical data. We see that you've been really concerned about this street for the last 10 years, and this is what we heard. I just want to make sure, is that still the case? Is there any update to that concern? Because that's what we want to address. But the concerns are there, and people just get real frustrated when it's like, I've already told you that 1,000 times. Why are you asking me again?
There's a certain hopelessness in some ways that comes from that, and there's nothing in some ways worse than hopelessness in a community if they don't think that there's any possibility of something changing.
We had a project one time. We were a subcontractor, but we had a project one time in a neighborhood where we were trying to just talk through this is the existing conditions and the data, and the prime was trying to do that. And this community, they were just not having it. They were going back. They were going through every email that they've ever sent about a specific issue. They were talking about 1973. This was the concern. And you're like, wow, you guys have 40 years of issues. And that's the problem with coming in with this. Tell me your concerns. And all consultants do it. And part of it is because that's the way the scope of work is written, where you'll have the first public meeting and we're going to find out from the community what their concerns. We know what their concerns are. It's really, I just want to check in. These are still your concerns. I want to check in. Is there anything that we missed?
Well, you've talked a little bit about this already in terms of turning it over to the appropriate body, but I wonder kind of how you respond. So say you go in, you've been tasked with a transportation plan for X community, and you go in and you realize that in the first public meeting that their concerns, their primary concerns are not about transportation issues. They might be about violence, or they might be about, housing stock or whatever they might be. But how do you kind of handle that when you go in and you've been tasked with a certain thing, and it turns out that that's not the primary need for that community?
Well, sometimes things are still interrelated. Housing is a little bit harder, but for things like, crime and violence, it still kind of dovetails into the transportation system. We had a project where that was a concern of the community, and you actually have to like tease out. Okay, well let's get to the root of it. And really, what the concern was, it's dark. Okay, it's dark. So we ended up doing a lighting inventory. The team ended up doing a lighting inventory to understand where's the lighting, and then how can we improve the lighting in the area, which was still part of kind of the transportation project. So there are sometimes things like that. Even when you look at crime, my old neighborhood, we did a safety audit with our local police officer. And it was little things like landscaping of, hey, can you cut these trees down to about, to this height? Because, right now you have this big bush by the door. That's an easy place for someone to hide. So we did that, and we added more lighting around the complex. We changed some of the landscaping such that there were better sight lines through the community. And as a result, we definitely saw a decrease in crime.
That's fascinating. Well, I wonder kind of, as you've looked back at your time doing this kind of work, I wonder if there are things that you now think are really important that kind of surprised you that you maybe didn't think when you got started that you think these are so important, or something that you've learned that's been really interesting to you along the way.
I think a thing that is, extremely important is I think that the civil engineering profession in particular needs to do a better job at the education level of teaching young engineers about how to do stakeholder engagement and how to engage the community. I gave a lecture at, Cornell about this. And, part of it is that, we work with all different types of engineering firms. And what happens is that you have engineering firms that technically they can design a really great street. Where they struggle is listening to the community and respecting the ideas of the community. There's a sense of, well, I am the engineer. I'm the licensed one. I know what I'm doing. And community, you just don't know what you're talking about. And I will fix this for you. And sometimes they fix things. Sometimes they make things worse. And I think that there's, going back to the early term of compassion, I think that civil engineers need to be reminded that our profession exists because of people. That is, the civil engineering is people. That is what we're built on. Everything that we do is designed to support civilization. And so in doing that, we need to be better listeners and better partners of the community, and have a sense of, humbleness of, I might know the right answer, but let's talk to me. Walk me through what's going on. Walk me through your, the challenges that you're facing as a community. I think that just needs to occur more. And I think part of it is that a lot of, engineers just don't get exposed to the understanding of the stakeholders. I gave a presentation during my lecture at Cornell. I said, I need you to design a bike lane. This is how wide the street is. This is how wide the bike lane needs to be. They could all do it, right? It's not that hard. I told you how wide the street is. I told you how wide the lanes need to be. They did it. Now I said, okay, I need you to go back in. I need you to do the same thing. I need you to take into account the community. This one doesn't want to lose parking. This business owner, and once you start layering on the reality of engineering, you realize the bulk of our work is trying to negotiate with all the different stakeholders and all the different interests that are involved in a project, and that's the hardest part of the project.
Oh, I can't imagine some of the frustration that those students must feel when they go out and realize that how unprepared they are for those conversations.
Absolutely. And then the ones that get it, they come to us.
Well, it's good that they have somewhere to go.
Well, and it's been really amazing. I was talking to, so I co-own Nspiregreen with Chauncey Lundy, and we were talking the other day of, just the amount of really smart young people that are coming to us, that are reaching out to us, that want to work for us. So it's really exciting. We actually find that our best have been people that came to us. So that's how we just do our recruiting. We just let them come to us.
Well, that cuts down on HR costs. So, hey,
Absolutely.
Well, I kind of hate to bring us to a close, but it's that time, and I wonder if you can kind of share a story with us to wrap everything up about what kind of when a community does this stuff well, when it understands how transportation works, or it understands how to engage its citizens well, how that can what can happen in that kind of circumstance?
I think that when cities are willing to put in the investment, because that's the other challenge too, is that cities want engagement, but then they allocate, $20,000 for engagement. Like, who are you engaging with that? But I think that when cities really put a focus on engagement and really invest in building enduring relationships with the communities that they serve, and that there is an investment in the project to true engagement and true planning with the community, you get a plan that the community is going to be proud of. You get a plan that the community is going to champion, and that they're going to make sure it continues to move forward.
Well, that's such a compelling vision, and you guys do such great work. If people are interested in finding out more about the work that you guys do, where can they find out more about you, Veronica?
Our website is www.nspiregreen.com. And because we're just unique, we don't spell Inspire with an I at the beginning. So it's Nspiregreen.
Very good. And if you all are interested in finding out more information about CityWorks Expo, you can find us at CityWorks XPO. That's right. We don't like to spell things right either. So it's cityworksxpo.com. But thank you so much for taking the time today, Veronica.
Thank you, and have a great day.
Once again, thank you for listening to the Big Ideas for Better Places podcast from CityWorks Expo. We truly hope you've enjoyed today's episode and come away thinking more deeply about something than you were before. If you have, we'd appreciate a rating or review in Apple Podcasts or wherever you might be listening to this. It really helps other people find out about the podcast and the great guests that we have on. Further, I'd like to welcome all of you all to check us out on CityWorks XPO, that's cityworksxpo.com, and learn about our annual gathering, CityWorks 8, where this year's theme is Anticipating 2050, Acting Today. We're really excited about what we have going on this year and some of the speakers that we have coming in. And we hope you'll join us in Roanoke, Virginia from October 4th through 6th and be part of what's really a very special event. But for now, thanks again for listening and have a great week.